For 27 years, they took away almost everything. His freedom, his family, his career, his youth, his ability to live an ordinary life. Nelson Mandela entered prison as a revolutionary. When he walked out, he was 71 years old, and something about him had changed. He had spent nearly 3 decades behind bars. He had performed hard labor. He had lived inside a tiny prison cell. He had watched his children grow up without him, and he had received news of devastating losses while knowing he could not simply leave his cell and go home. But when the prison gates finally opened, Mandela did something almost nobody expected. He didn't walk out promising revenge. He walked out asking a divided country to imagine a future together. That's what makes Mandela's story so difficult to understand, because strength is usually portrayed as defeating the people who hurt you. Mandela discovered something harder: how to resist without allowing hatred to become your identity. How to fight without losing sight of the country you were fighting to build. And eventually, how to hold power without becoming addicted to it. Because Nelson Mandela didn't simply survive 27 years in prison. He transformed what those 27 years could have made him. The boy who learned about power. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in Mvezo, in South Africa's Eastern Cape. He was born into the Thembu royal family, but being born into a royal lineage did not protect him from the reality of South African society. As Mandela grew older, racial discrimination shaped almost every part of life around him. Black South Africans faced restrictions on movement, residence, employment, political participation, and land. Mandela didn't begin his life as the revolutionary history would later remember him. He studied, he listened, he watched, and eventually he moved to Johannesburg. There, the contradictions of South African society became impossible to ignore. He studied law and eventually became one of the country's first black attorneys. But law wasn't enough. A legal system could not simply be used to correct injustice when the political system itself was designed to preserve it. Mandela joined the African National Congress. At first, resistance centered on political organization, protest, boycotts, strikes, and mass action, but the government responded with repression. Then came the Sharpeville Massacre in 1960. The government banned the ANC. Peaceful political activity became increasingly dangerous. Mandela's thinking began to change. This part of his story matters because it is often simplified. Mandela did not wake up one morning and suddenly decide that violence was the answer. The decision came after years of political struggle and a growing belief among Mandela and his colleagues that the government had closed the peaceful channels of resistance. In 1961, Umkhonto we Sizwe was formed. Mandela helped establish it. Its initial strategy centered on sabotage. It was a serious and controversial decision. Mandela himself later explained that it had not been made lightly, and that they believed peaceful avenues had been exhausted. He was no longer simply a lawyer challenging a system. He had become one of the people the government considered its greatest threats. And once that happened, there would be no easy way back. Chapter 2. The Man the Government Wanted to Silence. By the early 1960s, Mandela was living underground and operating under the name of a wanted revolutionary. In 1962, he was arrested. He was initially sentenced to 5 years in prison for leaving the country illegally and inciting workers to strike. But that was only the beginning. In 1963, police raided Lily's Leaf Farm in Rivonia. Documents connected to the armed struggle were discovered. Mandela was brought into what became the Rivonia trial. The prosecution sought severe punishment. Mandela and his co-accused faced the possibility of death. On April 20th, 1964, Mandela stood before the court and delivered his famous statement from the dock. He explained why he had fought against apartheid. He described the democratic society he hoped South Africa could become, and near the end, he made a declaration that would outlive the trial itself. He said the ideal of a free and democratic society was one he hoped to live for and achieve, but if necessary,
one he was prepared to die for. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. Mandela was taken to Robben Island. He was 46 years old.
He would remain imprisoned for decades. Think about what that means. 27 years. Enough time for a child to become an adult. Enough time for an entire generation to grow up. Enough time for the world outside to change completely. But Mandela remained behind walls. His cell was small. His movements were controlled. He performed hard labor in a limestone quarry, and the prison system attempted to reduce prisoners not only physically, but psychologically. Mandela was denied ordinary moments most people never think about: being present for his family, watching his children grow, leaving when someone he loved was dying, living according to his own decisions, growing old on his own terms. But there was one thing prison could not completely take from him: his ability to imagine what came next. And that became his greatest battle.
Chapter 3. The Classroom Behind Bars. Robben Island was a prison, but Mandela gradually turned it into something else: a classroom. A place where he studied politics, a place where he studied people, and perhaps most importantly, a place where he studied himself. Mandela exercised. He read, he debated, he educated younger prisoners, and he learned Afrikaans, the language spoken by many of the people who governed the prison. Why? Because understanding your opponent is different from surrendering to your opponent. Mandela wanted to understand the people on the other side of the conflict, their fears, their history, their worldview, their language. He understood that if South Africa was ever going to change, Black South Africans and white South Africans would eventually have to live in the same country, and that meant understanding the people he was fighting against. But this intellectual discipline came with an enormous personal cost. His mother died. His eldest son, Thembi, died in a car accident. Mandela was not permitted to attend the funeral. His wife, Winnie, also suffered devastating losses during his imprisonment. Each time, prison reminded him of what he had lost. Imagine receiving news that someone you love has died, and knowing you cannot simply leave. No plane, no car, no road, no door you can open. Just a cell, a locked door, and time. This is where Mandela's story becomes more than political history, because prison was constantly giving him reasons to become bitter, and yet he kept preparing for something that had no guaranteed date: freedom. He didn't know when it would come. He didn't know what South Africa would look like when it did. He didn't even know whether he would live long enough to see it, but he prepared anyway. That may be one of the most important lessons from those years. You don't prepare for the future because you know it will come. You prepare because you refuse to let uncertainty decide who you become. By the 1980s, Mandela was no longer simply a prisoner. He had become a symbol. Inside South Africa, resistance was growing. International pressure was increasing.
And eventually, the government began talking to the man it had once tried to silence. After 27 years behind bars, Mandela was finally going to find out what kind of man would walk out. Chapter 4. The Choice Nobody Expected. On February 11th, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison. He was 71 years old. The cameras were waiting. The world was watching. A man who had spent 27 years as a prisoner was suddenly free. But freedom created a new question. What would he do with it? Mandela could have demanded revenge. He had reasons. Apartheid had denied millions of people their rights. His own life had been taken from him for almost 3 decades. His family had suffered. His country had suffered. And now the man who had been imprisoned by the system had enormous moral authority. He could have used that authority to settle scores. Instead, he chose negotiation. That choice should not be misunderstood. Reconciliation did not mean forgetting apartheid. It did not mean pretending that suffering had never happened. And it did not mean that justice was unnecessary. It meant something more difficult. South Africa needed to build a future
in which yesterday's enemies could somehow share the same country. The transition was anything but peaceful. Political violence continued. Negotiations were fragile. Trust was almost non-existent. There were moments when the country appeared dangerously close to collapse, but Mandela kept pushing toward a democratic settlement. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic national election, in which citizens of all races could participate. Mandela won. At 75 years old, the man once classified as a dangerous prisoner became president of South Africa. Think about that transformation.
The government had spent decades trying to contain him. Now he was leading the government. But becoming president wasn't the final test. The real test was what he would do with power. Chapter 5. The man who chose what came next. Mandela understood something that many political leaders never learn. Winning a struggle is one thing. Building what comes afterward is another. South Africa had inherited enormous wounds, so Mandela emphasized reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission became one of the most powerful expressions of that approach. Victims were given opportunities to tell their stories. People responsible for abuses could come forward and seek amnesty under specific conditions. The process was painful. It was imperfect. It could not erase what had happened, but it attempted something extraordinary: to confront the past without allowing the past to permanently control the future. And then came another remarkable moment. South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup. Rugby and the Springbok team had long carried powerful political meaning in the country. For many white South Africans, the team represented national identity. For many black South Africans, it had represented something very different. Mandela saw an opportunity. He appeared wearing the Springbok jersey. Then he met the team's captain, Francois Pienaar. The moment became one of the defining images of the new South Africa. Mandela wasn't saying that history didn't matter. He was showing that history did not have to dictate the country's next chapter. You don't have to erase your differences to become one nation. You have to find a reason to stand together. And that is what makes Mandela's leadership so interesting. His greatest weapon after prison wasn't anger, it was restraint. He understood that the struggle wasn't simply about removing one group from power. It was about creating a country where power itself would not continue producing the same cycle of hatred. And then, in 1999, Mandela made one final decision that completed the lesson. He stepped down voluntarily. After one term as president, he left office. He could have stayed. He could have used his popularity to dominate South African politics for years. Instead, he handed power to the next generation. The man who had spent 27 years fighting for freedom did not spend his freedom desperately holding on to power. That may have been one of his greatest victories. Final reflection. What Mandela actually teaches us. History remembers Nelson Mandela as a symbol, a photograph, a president, a man walking out of prison. But symbols don't teach us very much. People do. And Mandela's life leaves us with a harder lesson. He spent 27 years waiting for freedom. But freedom wasn't simply the day the prison gates opened. The deeper freedom was the ability to decide who he would become. He could have allowed prison to make him bitter. He could have allowed injustice to consume him. He could have walked into freedom carrying 27 years of anger, and nobody would have blamed him. But he chose something harder. He chose to negotiate. He chose to rebuild. He chose reconciliation. And when he finally reached the highest office in his country, he chose not to hold on to it forever. That doesn't mean Mandela was perfect. He wasn't. His political journey was complicated. His decisions were controversial. His country remained deeply unequal. And reconciliation could not erase the damage caused by apartheid. But perhaps that's exactly why his story is worth studying. Not because he was a perfect man, but because his life demonstrates how a person can evolve without abandoning the principles that matter most of all. Most of us will never spend 27 years in prison. But all of us will experience things we didn't deserve: betrayal, loss, rejection, failure, unfairness, moments when life gives us every reason to become bitter. Mandela's life doesn't tell us that pain doesn't matter. It tells us
that pain doesn't have to decide what comes next. You cannot always control what happens to you, but you can fight to control what it turns you into. Mandela entered prison as a revolutionary. He walked out as an old man, and then he became something even more difficult to become, a leader who could hold enormous power without allowing power to become his identity. Maybe that's the question his life leaves us with. Not, why did this happen to me, but who am I becoming because of it? Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating the people who hurt you. Sometimes it's refusing to let them decide who you become. If Mandela's story changed the way you think about strength, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to Wisdom Everflow for more true stories from history that don't just inform you, they challenge you to see yourself different. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and let wisdom ever flow.